Greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. David Walton, and I'm Assistant Professor of History and Coordinator of the African American Studies minor at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. And this presentation is The Revolutionary Union Movement of Detroit, 1968 to 1972, an Africological analysis. Now, if you are curious on what is Africology and what is an Africological analysis, Africology is a formal name for Black studies, which has several different names like African American and African studies, Africana studies, Pan-African studies, African American studies, Black studies, right? But the general umbrella formal name is Africology. What to expect in this presentation: a demonstration of my scholarly contributions to the discipline of Africology, and by default, also the fields of Black history, labor history, Detroit history, and Black Power studies, as well as a demonstration of Africological research and teaching. You can also expect the use of the African-centered methodology, the use of analytical paradigms germane to Africology, and a corrective to the historiography. The use of the African-centered methodology. Two key points: A, privileging the voice or voices of my subjects. In this case, that will be the RUM movement, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And the use of multi-centers. In this case, the center of the Black workers, the center of the Black community, so the Black Community Center, as well as from the centers of the UAW and Capital, and other minor or lower centers as well, but the use of multi-centers. Also, the use of analytical paradigms germane to Africology. Those paradigms will be critical race theory, a structural analysis, Africana womanism, and Afrocentricity. And once again, I remind you, this is a corrective to the historiography. As one of the pioneer scholars of Black studies, Dr. Molefi K. Asante, pointed out in his book, Afrocentricity, Theory of Social Change, right? That this project is part of the process of it is the relocation part of the dislocation, location, and relocation mission of Africology. Movement structure. This is important. DRUM, the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, is the founder of the RUM movement. Then you have the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which I'll more often refer to as the League, which was a confederation of RUM locals. And then you have the RUM locals. And there's a list down there, but there were approximately 25 RUM locals across the nation, with the majority of them being in Michigan. Introductory interrogatives. Excuse me. What was the Revolutionary Union movement, or the RUM movement? Dodge Revolutionary Union movement began with the formation, Detroit's Revolutionary Union movement began with the formation of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, or DRUM, in 1968. Quickly spread to other factories and was consolidated under the banner of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in 1969, which remained active until 1972. RUM began in part as a direct response to verbal, political, physical, and production violence on Detroit automotive plants' shop floors. The League organized Black workers in conjunction with students and the broader community, and led a series of dramatic wildcat strikes that shut down production at several local automotive plants and galvanized the city's Black Power movement, which attracted the ire of the white establishment. Why is RUM important? Well, Black auto workers in Detroit faced endemic racism and exploitation under pre-existing white structures and domination, specifically the job, the union, in this case the UAW, and the state throughout the 1960s. Inspired by the Black Power movement and its emphasis on collective and militant action, the state's brutal and racist response to the 1967 Detroit Rebellion and racism in the automotive plants, a militant core of Black automotive workers with a predilection toward armed self-defense and informed by Black nationalists and anti-colonial thought emerged at the Dodge main assembly plant in Hamtramck, Michigan. This militant core sought to create a group consciousness among and organize Black workers to fight against their oppressors. This momentum resulted in a fevered opposition to the use of the labor process as a tool to further white domination. Between 1968 and 1973, a militant Black labor movement, RUM, began articulating a radical philosophy in the Detroit metropolis. After participating in a wildcat strike in which 2 central leaders were fired, Black auto workers established DRUM through a newsletter that called for majority representation in their UAW local, an end to racist practices, and improved working conditions that quickly spread to other automotive plants, initiating the RUM movement. Correcting the historiography, right? What is the problem, right? The Eurocentric era. The historiography is focused largely on a Marxist-Leninist analysis. No one has meaningfully engaged the movement with the keen consideration of its Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, leading to an incomplete analysis. For example, although limited, the historiography related to the League is important, well done, and expanding. RUM's birth and expansion are adequately covered by existing scholarship. A number of scholars have chronicled the League's history and have placed the group's founding and ultimate demise within the context of Detroit's New Left, the broader labor movement, or the political economy of the city of Detroit. Much of the scholarship related to the League, including Dan Georgakis and Marvin Sirkin's pioneering study, Detroit. I Do Mind Dying, a study in urban revolution, focused largely on a Marxist-Leninist analysis of the League's core group of leaders, emphasis on core group of leaders. James Gershwinder, for example, details the history of various RUMs, paying particular attention to the ideological tendencies, divisions, and contradictions that animated the League's rapid growth and decline. Additionally, there are explorations of gender within the movement, the League's pedagogy, and critiques of the union's propaganda, also through Marxist-Leninist analyses. Others place the League within the context of the long crusade for jobs and justice within the automotive industry. In that vein, David M. Lewis Coleman contextualized the League within the long history of Black worker struggles within the UAW, viewing RUMs as internal caucuses, allowing for an understanding of the movement's racialized and violent language and approach as a divergence from prior UAW, quote, Negro caucus movements, end quote, and general labor movements in Detroit. Heather Ann Thompson's Who's Detroit? Politics, Labor, and Race in a Modern American City engages and contextualizes RUM within Detroit's broader political and labor movements by employing a political economy analysis. Thus, Thompson explores violence in the James Johnson Jr. case as a part of a larger struggle between Detroit's liberals, conservatives, and radicals. Rooted in grievances filed through the UAW, Blood, Sweat, and Fear, Violence at Work in the North American Auto Industry, 1960 to 1980, Jeremy Malloy's comparative study of Chrysler workers in Detroit, Michigan, and Windsor, Ontario, Canada, reveals how structural violence and racism, coupled with the UAW's pivot towards a partnership with automotive capital and management, made Detroit shop floors acutely more violent. Apart from Thompson and Malloy, though, few have considered the role that violence and self-defense played in the formation of RUMs, as well as the strategies, tactics, and rhetoric they employed. Moreover, no one has meaningfully engaged the movement with a keen consideration of its Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism. My work expands upon these works by particularly scrutinizing previously underutilized drum newsletters and inner city voice editions, recorded and published interviews with League members, regional and national mainstream periodicals, as well as secondary sources to explore how RUM promoted violence. Heeding Pernell Joseph's observation of, quote, the importance of local history to understanding the complexity of the Black freedom struggle, end quote, this study seeks to contribute to the current historiography on the League specifically and Detroit's Black Power movement more broadly. Although much of the historiography minimizes the significance that race-based organizing and Black nationalism played in RUM's development and growth, The lens of Black power and dissecting such movements with a dual Marxist-Leninist and Black nationalist understanding offers exciting opportunities for scholars of the movement. The Africological corrective, right? And I dissect RUM with an Africological analysis that centers a Black nationalist understanding and trajectory while appreciating the revelations of Marxist-Leninist analyses, providing a deeper grasp of the African-American experience. RUM's Black nationalist roots and proclivities. Founding and key members, previously being members in prominent Detroit Black nationalist organizations and movements, the use of Afrocentric iconography and cultural production, Black separatism and Black vanguardism, Pan-Africanism, and the plantation model of labor and economics, right? So let's focus first on founding and key members of RUM who were previous members of prominent Black nationalist organizations, right? To reiterate the League's Black nationalist roots and leanings, it must be noted that many of the founders of RUM were members of Black nationalist and Pan-Africanist organizations and movements years before founding DRUM and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Prior Black nationalist activities are not surprising due to the long history of Black nationalism, the high concentration of auto workers, and the influence of Malcolm X in Detroit. In the 1960s and early 1970s, organizations such as the Republic of New Africa, or RNA, the Revolutionary Action Movement, or RAM, which Malcolm X joined in 1964, the Shrine of the Black Madonna Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church and Community Center, often just called the Shrine of the Black Madonna, and the African Nationalist Pioneer Movement, or the ANPM, were developing institutions and forcibly promoting Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism in Detroit. In fact, the remarkable painting of the Black Madonna in Child for the Shrine of the Black Madonna was crafted by Glayton Dowdell and General Baker, who at the time were members of RAM. General Baker and Luke Tripp were also members and co-founders of Uhuru, a RAM-affiliated student organization at Wayne State University in Detroit, and they would later become co-founders of DRUM and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Some of the, quote, most influential young Black activists in Detroit, end quote, such as General Baker, Luke Tripp, Mike Hamlin, Diane Bernard, John and Edna Watson, John Williams, Kenneth Cockrell, Gwen Kemp, Cassandra Smith, Chuck and Gracie Wooten, and Charles Simmons were associated with or co-founded the aforementioned organizations. All of those will become members of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Also, in 1968, the U.S. government identified Black nationalist leaders, activists, and organizers like Luke Tripp and RAM member Max Stanford as, to quote the government, advocates for guerrilla warfare, end quote, in Detroit. Here is a photo right here where I'm pointing at. Hopefully you can see it. The guy with the glasses is Luke Tripp. This is General Baker. This is Charles Simmons. And this is Ernie Allen, who I didn't mention, but he is a prominent scholar of the Black radical left. Charles Simmons, now Dr. Charles Simmons, is retired. He was a professor of journalism at Eastern Michigan University. Dr. Luke Tripp is now a professor in Minnesota. I forget the name of the school. I want to say St. Cloud University, but I could be so wrong. And General Baker, who recently passed away, continued as a labor activist later in his life. RUM's Black nationalist roots and proclivities, right? The Black nationalist influence, as seen in Uhuru's publication, The Black Vanguard, included the nationalistic use of violent rhetoric, would remain extremely evident in RUM literature throughout its existence. So, right, that early Uhuru use of nationalistic use of violent rhetoric will remain extremely evident in RUM literature throughout RUM's existence. In their newsletters, DRUM spoke of the importance of Black identity, Black unity, and human dignity. In essentially every newsletter, they would use African icons signifying violence and armed struggle, such as African drums, African spears, and images of African warriors and liberation fighters to make cultural connections between their readers and Africa. the use of African icons and an Afrocentric aesthetic increased steadily in raw materials in the Drum newsletter from its inception until its demise. True to their broader Black-centered roots, the League was deeply involved in community organizing and struggle. For a labor union, community involvement expands its purview beyond shop floor issues. In doing so, RUM was also grounded in the community and briefly established itself as a shield and weapon in a city drowning in violence. For example, RUM led successful boycotts against several Hamtramck and Detroit merchants over allegations of racism and hoped to organize Black Detroit area high school students and parents. These are examples from their newsletters of the use of spears, drums, African warriors, and etc. RUM's Black nationalist roots and proclivities, Black separatism, and Black vanguardism. Drum also organized themselves along racial lines, promoting a Black separatist approach to unionism informed by a notion of Black vanguardism similar to Stokely Carmichael's theorization of coalition politics and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense's Vanguard of the Revolution motto. As League Executive Board member Mike Hamlin later noted, RUM advocated a, quote, revolutionary separatist politics that was designed to break completely from the labor establishment and reject integrated class struggle, end quote. Moreover, the League understood that white racism hindered the development of a universal proletariat because white workers viewed Black workers and not the company as the enemy. The goal was to establish all Black unions, since from their perspective, the UAW was actually an organization that stood for the acronym, quote, United All Whites, end quote. They did theorize an approach described as Black vanguardism to coalitions with white labor, as evidenced by their aiding in creating separate all-white radical groups attended as their anti-racist white counterparts. And here's examples from Drum and RUM newsletters where they use Black power iconography. The Black Panther, known for the Lowndes County Freedom Party, as well as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, the Black Power Fist, used in both Lowndes County and in the Oakland-based Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and then someone with a semi-automatic weapon with the words Black Power. Right. RUM's Black nationalist roots and proclivities, Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, at least from the American perspective, is Black nationalism's internationalist outlook, or at the very least, its framework. Pan-Africanism and internationalism were critical to the League's endeavor to create a Black consciousness amongst Black automotive workers in Detroit, and served as a way for RUM to also frame violence as an anti-colonial revolutionary acts. The Inner City Voice published an essay by West Indian scholar C.L.R. James examining the ideologies of Pan-Africanist pioneers Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois and George Padmore, and Pan-Africanist theoretician France Fanon. RUM theorized that Black automotive workers' connections to Africa and its diaspora went beyond cultural, expanding to contemporary liberation struggles, with the implication being that their struggles in Detroit were linked to a global struggle for the liberation of all African descendant peoples. To demonstrate this, the Inner City Voice published a map of independent African nations, independent states that were what they deemed the vanguard of the African Revolution, and those engaged in armed liberation struggles. Here, I did a poor job cutting and paste, it wouldn't convert over. Well, this was the map. They had this photo at the bottom. They had this in chat highlighted and within it, but it didn't come through with the cut and paste from the PDF the PDFs I have of the Drum and League of Revolutionary Workers newsletters, but the map was inside there. But I at least wanted to show you guys this and demonstrate this. Right. Now, the plantation model of labor and economics, right? And this is a Black nationalist analytical paradigm that frames societal stratification differently from the Marxist-Leninist industrial model, instead viewing it for Black people in terms of a commercial plantation during slavery and sharecropping in the Americas. The plantation model was used to interpret the historical, racial, and economic exploitation Black workers faced. The plantation model considers how racialized oppression complicates the strict class distinctions. See, in this case, we're talking within the Black community during Jim Crow segregation. And my case study picks up at the end, the tail end of that in Detroit, right? The Black community was oppressed, right? The lowest class on social stratification. But within that Jim Crow Black community, you would have upper middle class, working class, and poor, poverty-stricken people living in one community. Also, jobs that are deemed or were deemed as middle class jobs in the Black community were not. They were actually viewed as upper middle class jobs. For example, being a janitor in the Black community at the time was viewed as a upper middle class job, right? But they weren't the bourgeoisie. See, that's why that Marxist-Leninist industrial model doesn't necessarily fit perfectly or fit well every time when we're analyzing Black communities, right? This is key, right? Also, in the plantation model, the plantation owner, or in this case, as the league framed it, they would be the company, employed plantation managers and overseers, in this case, company management and foremen/supervisors, and underwrote the local militias. In this case, it was plant protection and local law enforcement, which were designed to squash any slave revolt, in this case, a worker uprising. That's how the league presented it. That's how they analyzed it. They didn't analyze it from a vulgar or strict Marxist-Leninist analysis. They made the connection back to the plantation, right? The pre-industrial plantation, right? This is very, very key. They followed that trajectory. They talk about in their newsletters how they felt like slaves. They described the supervisors and managers in plantation concepts like what? Overseer, right? Master, right? How that the management and supervisors in the company wanted to control every aspect of these Black workers' lives, right? Like on a plantation during slavery and sharecropping, right? The controlling of every aspect of these Black people's lives, right? They made that connection, right? And the league discovered that the UAW Local 3, which was the Dodge main plant, UAW Local, was underwriting the Hamtramck police and fire departments. And we will talk a little bit later, but the Hamtramck police was used by Chrysler to physically assault, abuse, and beat Black workers and to squash Black workers' uprisings. The UAW used their paramilitary wing called the Flying Squadron, which was created to fight the mafia's strike breakers, right? So these were goons, but now they were turning this weapon against Black auto workers. Right? Abusive and violent work conditions and RUM's responses, right? And right, so we have structural violence, collective violence, workplace violence, interpersonal violence, sexual violence, and language violence. Let's see if I have enough time to read this. I believe I have, so I'll briefly, in fact, I won't. I think that will just waste time, and we approach it this way. We'll start with structural violence faced by Black auto workers, right? We have production speedups, which caused the first initial wildcat strike, the May 2nd, 1968 wildcat strike that started the RUM movement, right? That led to the creation of DRUM, right? So speedups, right? Dangerous speedups, right? UAW election cheating, right? The league decided to run some candidates in 2 local UAW local elections, right? And the UAW cheated, definitely in one at Dodge, Maine, when Ron March, a league member, ran as trustee of Local 3, right? And they cheated. They used law enforcement to help them cheat by intimidating and attacking Black workers and targeting their cars when they were shuttling Black workers over to the Union Hall to cast their ballot. They ripped down their campaign materials. They even brutalized. They beat some Black workers. Yes, they did that. Yes, the UAW with the help of Hamtramck Police Department, right? And that's the type of cheating. And then they had a bunch of retired white workers come and vote in that election to assure that the league's candidates did not win, right? Hiring practices, right? Black people were obviously the last hired, first fired, but more importantly than that, right, is that it was a practice of whites, in this case, mostly Polish Americans in Hamtramck in Detroit, but particularly at Dodge, Maine Assembly in Hamtramck, Michigan, of hiring relatives of other workers. Supervisors used to have input in the hiring, and they would hire their relatives, keeping many things in the hands of these white American, Polish American workers, making it a family affair, right? And that leads to job assignments. So white workers were given the safest jobs, the easiest jobs, and Black workers were given the most dangerous jobs and the hardest jobs and the dirtiest jobs. And even if, quoting the League of Revolutionary Black Workers from one of their newsletters, quoting Dr. Luke Tripp, even if a white worker had the unfortunate luck of being put in a Black area, they would be given the easiest and cleanest job, even in that context. And what they said, even if that meant moving or demoting a Black worker with more seniority, right? So job assignments, right? Police physical assault. I think I've addressed it, and there's many instances of that, right? And then UAW security assault. And I think I've addressed that as well, but there are many instances. So what were their responses to structural violence, right? The creation of RUN, and then getting involved in UAW elections. That was their response. Then we have collective violence. And that would be, in this case, white, racial, ethnic, and geographic solidarity. White workers showed solidarity based upon whiteness, based upon ethnic, and that would be Polish ethnicity, as well as family, as I've already mentioned, and geographic, right? Whites moving from the South to the North, to Detroit area to work in the automotive industry, right? They showed white, racial, ethnic, and geographic solidarity. And what was the Black workers' response? Black solidarity, right? They responded, right, with Black solidarity. Workplace violence. And the reason I put this in quotes, because this is probably what most people think of when they think about violence, besides what someone going postal, as they call it, right, is what? Unsafe working conditions. People die. There's several accounts that they talk about, and that is corroborated in secondary sources that I've mentioned when I talked about the historiography, particularly Heather Thompson's text, as well as Jeremy Malloy's text, but as well as primary sources, right? So I've corroborated that. And, you know, there's several instances, but there's one, Sister Mammy Williams, James Johnson Jr. himself, and et cetera. But there are many instances where Black workers working in these dangerous conditions lost their lives, lost their limbs, lost digits on their hands and feet. Like I already mentioned, lost limbs. So we're talking about death and maiming, right? And Chrysler's factories, the Eldon Avenue axle plant, as well as Dodge, Maine, they were infamous around the country of being the most dangerous, right? And they give firsthand accounts in their newsletters, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, about workers working in these conditions and losing limbs and digits and running around bloodied and all this, trying to keep pace. And then on top of that, you add these speed ups, right? And because of job assignments, then Black workers were anchored to these most dangerous jobs, often with multi-generations. It was not uncommon, according to the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, to have working on the assembly line a grandfather, a father, and a grandson, right? So this is like people, this is literal life, right? This isn't metaphoric. These people were literally dying on the workplace. And the union, the UAW, would not step up and advocate because they had decided for their survival to cut a deal in a partnership with capital, i.e. the companies, right? Interpersonal violence, right? And this will be physical assaults. So there's, as indicated in Thompson and Malloy's text, as well as in the League's newsletters and corroborated through primary sources, that white foremen and supervisors frequently beat, attacked, assaulted Black workers on the shop floor. I can't emphasize this enough, right? And how did Black workers respond? With their own physical assaults on white workers, white supervisors, and then sometimes Black supervisors, right? So that's how the Black workers responded. That's how the Run movement responded, physical assaults. So we got people fighting on the shop floor, people bringing pistols, people having shootouts in the parking lot, people running each other over, leaving the factories, right? Just think about how serious, dangerous this is. These are the conditions these Black workers toiled under, and the UAW was not aiding them. Who they were paying dues to. In fact, the UAW was underwriting local law enforcement that was abusing them. Sexual violence, faced more often by the very few, but still important, Black women who were working on those shop floors, right? Sexual assault, right? And how did Black workers respond? With threats of physical assault, right? You white male workers sexually assault Black women workers. Direct quote, excuse my language, this is a direct quote from the League, we gonna bust your head. Another quote, we are going to bust your ASS, right? I mean, right? They even protected Black women, walking them to their cars and things of that nature because of these repeated allegations of sexual assault. And sexual assault is a broad term, and I chose that deliberately, right? Because, you know, you have sexual harassment, you have rape, you know, there's many layers to sexual assault. That's why I use that broad term. Language violence, right? Black auto workers face racist, abusive, sexist, dehumanizing language, right? Like calling them Black boys, calling these grown men boys, right? Calling the Black women, excuse my language, but these are direct quotes, Black bitchs, and et cetera, et cetera. Language of misrepresentation, right? Calling these Black workers that were organizing and trying to organize, you know, communists, commies, right? And we know at the time that was a word put on someone to justify what? The abuse and violations of their rights and their suppression of their constitutional rights, right? Bloodthirsty, murderous maniacs, right? So they use this language of misrepresentation. This is violence, right? This is epistemological violence, right? And how did they respond? With aggressive language, right? White foremen called them niggers. They called them Polish pigs, and et cetera, et cetera. They called them Black boys, right? They called them punks. They called the white supervisors and racist white workers punks, right? So we see this layer, this language of violence, or they call them crackers or hunkies, right? These, you know, this aggressive language, you know, so they're hurling language violence at one another on the shop floor, in the union hall. Like, just think of how toxic, right? All right, let me catch my place and let me drink some water. I'm sorry, guys. Thank you. Great. So UAW's patronizing, paternalism, racism, and violent collusion with state and capital. Why? Why would they do this, right? And this is understood via the use of critical race theory, particularly one pillar of critical race theory, interest convergence or material determinism. And what is interest convergence? There's two aspects of it, right? One aspect is every time a minority group is giving increased rights or increased protections, right, it is done for the benefit of the dominant group, and the dominant group itself too receives extended benefits and extended protections, right? The second aspect is two groups that are members of the dominant group, if they have conflict with one another, right, they will temporarily set aside their conflict with one another for a mutual benefit, which usually involves the suppression of minority groups. That's the two aspects of interest convergence or material determinism, hence interest convergence, where the interests converge, right? The interest between the dominant group and the minority groups converge, or between two, for lack of a better way to put it, warring subgroups within a dominant group, their interests converge, right? So the interests of the union, the UAW, converged with state and capital in the suppression of these Black workers, because the auto industry was going through one of its many, many downturns, right? So the UAW was trying to keep as many of its members from being laid off, right? The capital, the companies, was trying to maximize profits, so aligning with the UAW to what? Not force these safety concerns to be addressed, right? To not address racism, right? And focus on what? Production, right? Not walking out because of speed ups, right? But bearing it, right? For the mutual benefit of them and capital. And then the state, right? All the taxes, politics, right? The UAW represented the moderate left, right? And at the time in Detroit, Black radicals were coming up and white radicals were coming. So the radical left was emerging. So to pivot or to counteract or to counterbalance that, the state, the machinery in the state, so that's the Democratic Party in Detroit, right? The UAW, a major stakeholder in that, right? They colluded together to suppress, right? A culture of racism and white privilege is why that patronizing and paternalism, right? UAW, state and capital were all threatened by RUM. RUM threatened the UAW's existence. It threatened the status quo of the state, and it threatened the profits of capital, right? The RUM represented a Black radical attempt to what? Seize the modes of production, right? And it also was the weakness of the UAW of the late 1960s and 1970s because of the concessions they made to capital. After Walter Reuther died, they got extremely weak. Let's just be honest. And then corruption, right? So now gender, manhood, and masculinity as understood via Afrocentricity, right? The League of Revolutionary Black Workers also used gendered images and language to communicate violence as a revolutionary tactic. Luke Tripp wrote that in automotive plants, management didn't want Black men. Instead, he argued they only wanted Black boys as workers, as they could be forced to sell their manhood while being molded into compliant and meek laborers. The League's reading of gender and Black manhood necessitated the development of a strong, self-assertive, proud, and dignified Black men who were viewed as apposite emissaries for the racially oppressed Black community in their struggle against a patriarchal, white supremacist, and exploitive society. Conversely, the valuing, exaltation, and protection of Black women and Black womanhood was presented as a vital virtue of Black manhood and national struggle. Thus, the redemption and assertion of Black manhood was an important tool against the violences they endured, as it was connected to the establishment of a will to dare to fight and dare to win, the League slogan. Informed in part by what scholar Farah Jasmine Griffin called Malcolm X's promise of protection, Rum wanted to redeem and reclaim their own understanding of manhood, rather than the notion of manhood presented by the colonial, white supremacist, capitalistic, and patriarchal world order. For Rum, that included the ability to protect Black women from violence on the shop floor and union hall. Essentially, the League hoped to offer what Malcolm offered to Black women, which was a promise of protection and an, quote, acknowledgement of the significance of white racist assaults against Black women's very existence, end quote. An excellent example is when Black men in El Rum, that would be the Eldon Avenue branch of Rum, threatened white male UAW members who harassed 3 Black women who were members of the UAW local's election committee. They also committed to be present at all future meetings to prevent intimidation of Black women by white men. According to their newsletter, El Rum also endeavored to, quote, protect Black women from the effects of discriminatory job assignments that privileged white women and left Black women in the worst jobs in the plants, end quote. Importantly, El Rum had more women members than any other Rum at the time, although men still dominated the Rum local. Despite Rum's male-centeredness, women were essential contributors to their movement and were also inspired by Malcolm X, particularly by what Betty Shabazz biographer Sheila Radford Hall describes as his womanism. As observed by Radford Hill, with Malcolm's motto for organization, gender segregation, or I should say, quote, gender segregation, patriarchal dominance, rigid hierarchies, and intolerance of criticism or debate began to shift toward a more participatory and egalitarian approach to organizational leadership, end quote. Malcolm's practice, quote, involved building Black women's leadership by establishing their roles based on their skills, commitment, and dedication, end quote. We see this explicitly in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the Rum movement. Rum had crucial support from 3 important community organizations: UNICOM, the West Central Organization, the North Woodward Interfaith Project, which were all led by women. As stated by General Baker, without the women, Rum wouldn't have had many resources. Despite male dominance at the point of production, due to the demographics of the auto workers, women like General Baker's future wife, Mary Ann Kramer, Cassandra Bell, and Betty Griffin were rare but active Rum activists. In fact, Kramer, too a co-founder of Drum, was a prominent Detroit activist with ties to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense Detroit contingent, and the influential West Central Organization. Importantly, Kramer also organized tenants unions, partnered with the West Side Mothers, a welfare rights group, and organized against urban renewal and police brutality. It is without question that the ironies, contradictions, and virtues of Rum's Black nationalistic approach to gendered issues were indeed problematic, particularly their view of Black manhood vis-a-vis white manhood. Yet, as reflected in Rum, quote, Black feminist organizations were an important part of the grassroots support for Black power, end quote. However, Radford Hill calls attention to Black men's long, complicated history of trying to reconcile their inclinations to replicate white male patriarchy in their efforts to overcome a contradiction fundamentally expressed in that promise, right? As the promise of protection was couched in the same exact violences used by white Southern men to, quote, repress white women and to systematically brutalize Black men, all in the name of protection and race purity, end quote. The silence of women and acts of misogyny within Rum are further laid bare by that reality. Nonetheless, despite struggling within a male-dominated labor process and facing male chauvinism inside Rum, women demanded and exercised agency. As Rum activist Cassandra Bell noted, women fought to be heard and have their ideas considered. So, reevaluating women, their weaknesses as determined by Marxist-Leninists were strengths as determined by an Africologist, myself. So what was viewed as their weaknesses by Marxist-Leninists, using the Africological analysis, I view them as their strengths, and that's community-centered and oriented, race-based organizing, and the use and promotion of violence. Let's start with community-centered and oriented, right? Vulgar and strict Marxist-Leninists will argue that labor should only focus on shop floor issues and shop floor concessions, right? Not community-centered or community-based issues, right? Well, for these Black people, and viewing it through the plantation model, they could not separate the two. So the support that they got, they wouldn't have got if they didn't have community centeredness and weren't community oriented. You got to remember, they organized parents and students. They successful boycotted merchants, right? Those aren't shop floor issues, those are community issues, but that is how they got their community support. Race-based organizing, right? I wouldn't even have nothing to talk about if they didn't do race-based organizing. Why? Because it was in response to the white workers within the UAW putting race before class. So these Black workers to have their issues addressed, their issues of racism, their race-based issues, then they had to prioritize race over class, race-based organizing. Use and promotion of violence. They were literally fighting for their survival. They were literally fighting for their survival, right? No one bashes the UAW for their use and promotion of violence to establish themselves, right? I'm from Michigan, right? So we can go all the way back to the 20s and 30s, right? Starting in Flint, Michigan, General Motors, big strike, violence, right? We could talk about Henry Ford. We could talk about the mafia, all that, right? Violence, right? But the use and promotion of violence to protect oneself, armed self-defense, preemptive self-defense, and for the literal survival, right? They wouldn't have attracted Black workers. They wouldn't have attracted the younger, more militant, the more radical Black workers of the Black Power era if it wasn't for the use and promotion of violence, right? Now, here, we see here, and I'm going to point to it, you see these two graphics published in League of Revolutionary Black Workers literature and RUM literature, right? On the left, Black auto workers' one and only solution to big three auto tricks, right? You can't see it here, but the big three, because it cut off a little bit, is Chrysler, General Motors, Ford, the big three, right? And they said the Johnson method, and they have somewhere there shooting these guys as they divvy up the profits with a shotgun. And then we have to the right, I have a with dream scratched out and gun replaced, attributed to a brother. I have a gun. Now, it's important to remember that first wildcat strike, May 2nd, 1968, was just under 1 month after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in April of 1968. So this was a powerful and meaningful graphic, and it indicated what? That they were willing to use armed self-defense and violence, right? Indeed. Via their independently produced literature, Drum, by default, the later broader RUM movement under the banner of the League, attempted to evoke Black nationalistic solidarity among Black workers to confront the violences inflicted by production speed-ups, unsafe workplace conditions, the assigning of work, abusive racist language, sexual harassment, and political repression and cheating on the shop floor and in the union hall. RUM would too utilize and promote violent language and physical violence, shutdowns, and the promotion of them all as forms of protective and preemptive violence against the white labor aristocracy, capital, and the state. Reflecting their promotion of preemptive and protective violence, in the third edition of their newsletter, Drum published a cartoon indicating that instead of having a dream like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was assassinated almost 1 month before the wildcat strike that provided for its genesis, that they had guns. This is reflective of RUM's belief that the institutionalized racism and violence that Black workers face daily from the UAW and automotive companies were identical and interconnected to the racism and violence Black people experience in every sector of society, thus essentially fusing community and shop floor issues. In October 1970, the League's organ, the Inner City Voice, published The Johnson Method, a political cartoon supporting the recent actions of James Johnson Jr., a Black auto worker at the Chrysler's Eldon Avenue Gear and Axle plant, who, after being subjected to racial abuse, medical malpractice from the plant doctors, and a humiliating demotion to the brake oven, returned to the plant after receiving a suspension and shot and killed 2 foremen and a skilled worker. As the cartoon makes clear, the League portrayed Johnson, who was not affiliated with the League or Rum movement, in heroic terms. They celebrated Johnson's willingness to respond violently to the violence and racism he encountered on the job, and went so far as to publish a poem entitled "The Ballad of James Johnson." James Johnson needed a Thompson, suggesting that a submachine gun would have been more effective than the .30-06 rifle he used. Summarization and quick review. For many Black auto workers in Detroit during the 1960s and early 1970s, the political economy was epitomized by axe handles and guns wielded by police and UAW personnel. Black workers also toiled under conditions of perpetual violence on the shop floor, as demonstrated by structural violence, forced unsafe labor conditions, and abusive language, leading to the creation of RUM, with structural violence, as asserted by public health experts, being, quote, often the most pervasive because of its invisibility, end quote. I assert that Black nationalism was essential to RUM's ability to make it visible. The UAW's unwillingness or inability to address Black auto workers' complaints concerning racism, job discrimination, and other forms of violence led directly to the creation and development of RUM, which in turn used violence as a tactic against their oppression and exploitation. Violence was integral to the creation, development, and articulations of RUM. Without the promotion of protective and preemptive violence, it would not have gained as much traction amongst the disaffected, younger, more militant Black auto workers of the era. Local municipalities, political establishment, automotive manufacturers, and the UAW responded with a wave of repression to destroy RUM and stop it in its tracks. These actions in the UAW's paternalism and racism prevented interracial, class-based worker consciousness and solidarity from emerging in Detroit's automotive plants during the Black Power era. As a result, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and its RUM locals espoused a Black nationalist and revolutionary analysis of violence. The League's articulation and practice of violence to combat oppression is perhaps best represented by their support of the Johnson method, which championed picking up a gun as a powerful tactic in the fight against white supremacy and racial capitalism. In doing so, the League emphasized the intersectionality of anti-Black violence on the shop floor and in the community. Yet, there's no doubt that the League appropriated James Johnson Jr.'s narrative for its purposes, turning him into a Black revolutionary folk hero of sorts. As white workers use ethnicity, familial ties, and country of origin within the UAW and on the shop floor to exert and preserve white privilege, Black nationalism was some Black workers' response. White workers routinely put race above class, and RUM responded by also placing racial solidarity over class solidarity. To that point, the Drum newsletter informed its readers that RUM, quote, recognizes and identifies racism as the common denominator that will unite all Black workers, but it also goes further and identifies our enemies as the racist U.S. government, the greedy racist owners and operators of the means of production in this country, and the number one tool of management, that racist union bureaucracy, as well as the complacent white worker himself, end quote. RUM went well beyond wages, the holy grail of business unionism, and also concerned itself with job assignments, promotions, and supervisory appointments, an important consideration when examining Black labor struggle for freedom and equality on the shop floor. Doing so moves our understanding beyond shop floor equality and towards a deeper comprehension of the effects of various violences and Black people's responses to them. Simply, RUM believed that they were fighting for Black auto workers' literal survival in unsafe working conditions, for simple human dignity in a shop floor environment rooted in physical harm and danger, as well as against dehumanizing harassment and insults. It is reasonable to ponder the wisdom of RUM's use and promotion of violence, bearing in mind that some of the movement's best shop floor organizers were fired for acts of violence and could no longer step foot on company property. These individual acts of dignity and defiance to right rule offended moderate Negro and white liberal workers alike, curtailing their support of the movement. As a Black Power organization, however, the League expected that resistance as one of the aims. So they expected that resistance from the moderate Negro, because as a Black Power organization, right, it expected that resistance because one of the aims of the Black Power movement was the transition of thinking and identity from Negro to Black. That transition from Negro to Black. Some may be inclined to apply one of the usual critiques of the Black Power movement to RUM's approach to violence, and that is its adherents lack discipline, particularly considering the League's emphasis on the importance of organizations in Blacks. Yet, historically, the approaches of moderate Negroes and liberal whites had proven unsuccessful in the amelioration of Black auto workers' status at the point of production, and their failures contributed to the rise of RUM. If Baker et al. Followed the prescriptions of those critics that were, there would not have been a RUM to analyze. RUM's success with younger and more militant Black auto workers was their Black nationalism and Black power praxis, which the UAW was incapable of doing. Key to Black power theorization is the notion that if pre-existing institutions, in this case the UAW, do not address the concerns or suit the needs of Black people, then Black people will simply create their own. The League of Revolutionary Black Workers was just as much as, if not more of, a Black power organization as it was Marxist, Leninist, or Maoist. Praxis. Present and future implications. As the labor market becomes increasingly global and continues on its current evolutionary path, right? How to develop a comprehensive and integrative shop floor and community approach, right? So, that's some praxis that we can get out of this case study, right? Particularly as now we have less manufacturing, more service industry, right? How can we integrate these so-called shop floor and community approaches, right, in a more comprehensive way to affect positive change in these communities? Identify and diagnose obstructions to a comprehensive labor movement, right? I mean, one we can still identify easily, right, is what? Racism and white workers positioning white privilege over class solidarity, right? I mean, we see this in the contemporary labor movement, where people are voting for politicians whose policies are detrimental and contrary to the goals of the labor movement, right? But you have these labor men and women voting for these politicians, right? So, we have to be able to identify and diagnose these obstructions to a comprehensive labor movement. And I think this case study gives us an entree into being able to begin to identify these obstructions in contemporary context. Develop solutions to those obstructions. Key. We're talking about Africology, Black studies. Praxis is key. It's not knowledge production for the sake of knowledge production. It is knowledge production for the sake of training and preparing people in the community to improve the status of the community. And this will be the questions, comments, or concerns. And I just want to put this last slide up. This is a selected bibliography, so you can see some of the stuff, the secondary sources that I was quoting. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Hopefully it's something you enjoyed. I hope you have a lot of questions. Definitely look forward to answering any questions. Once again, my name is Dr. David Matthew Walton, dual PhD from Michigan State University, one in history, one in Black studies. I am now assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke, as well as the African American Studies minor coordinator. Thank you all. Enjoy your day. Stay safe.